Hello and welcome back to another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. I'm Thomas Watson, and this 8-inch friend of mine is Thomas Jefferson, the bobblehead, and star of the show. In this episode, TJ and I will feature the life and times of America's saddest president, Franklin Pierce. This is a show we think you'll really enjoy. So, without any further delay, please sit back, grab a bowl of freshly baked apple pandowdy, a favorite of Franklin's, and enjoy the show. Franklin Pierce was born in a small cabin along the Contoocook River on November 23, 1804. When the river was dammed in 1926, the 483-acre reservoir known as Franklin Pierce Lake was created. Unfortunately, the lake covered the presidential birthplace forever, which meant the cabin was somewhere out there behind me beneath Franklin Pierce Lake. Shortly after Franklin's birth, the family moved out of the cramped cabin and into this home, built in 1804 by the future president's father, Benjamin Pierce. Franklin grew up in this house where he was a robust and devilish youngster, quick to either fight someone or pull a prank on them. For 30 years after his birth, Franklin lived in this house, with the exception of the 7 years he was away from Hillsborough, either at college or studying law. I'm posing on the step of an entryway to what might have been the tavern Benjamin Pierce operated in the home. In the distance to my right, it's easy to see the south entrance to the main part of the home. When Pierce married Jane Appleton in 1834 after 7 years of courtship, Franklin brought his new bride back to Hillsborough to live in this home. The newlyweds' stay in this home was short-lived, however, as the new Mrs. Pierce disliked Hillsborough and insisted they move to Concord. After Franklin Pierce graduated from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine in 1824, he studied law for the next 3 years. Although Pierce was admitted to the New Hampshire bar in 1827 and practiced law in Hillsborough, Franklin was elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives in 1828. Pierce served in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, where I'm posing, from January 7, 1829 to January 2, 1833. In fact, Pierce was Speaker of the House for his last 2 years in Congress. Franklin Pierce left Concord and headed to our nation's capital after he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1833. Pierce served 2 terms in Congress where he steadfastly supported the policies of President Andrew Jackson. Franklin Pierce married Jane Appleton on November 19, 1834, in the home of her grandparents in Amherst, New Hampshire. Even though Jane disliked politics and hated Washington even more, Franklin Pierce was elected to the United States Senate in 1836. Senator Pierce served from March 4, 1837 to February 28, 1842, which was when he resigned due to his wife's constant nagging of wanting to return to Concord. After he was persuaded by his wife to resign his Senate seat, Franklin, Jane, and their two sons, Frankie and Benny, returned to Concord in 1842 and moved into this newly constructed home, now known as the Pierce Manse. During the 6 years Franklin and his family lived here, the home did not have a name. It wasn't called the Pierce Manse until 1969. In December 1847, Pierce returned to this home as a hero of the Mexican-American War. During the war, Franklin had risen to the rank of brigadier general. Now it's time to follow me through this door and into the world of Franklin Pierce and his family. I'm standing in the home's parlor with the dining room behind me. The sofa below the portrait of President Pierce belonged to Jane and was used in their White House living quarters. The table alongside me was also used in the White House by the Pierces. The portrait above the fireplace was Franklin's father, Benjamin Pierce, who died on April 1, 1839. As a soldier in the Revolutionary War, Benjamin was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. In 1827, Pierce was elected as New Hampshire's 11th governor. President Pierce used his small writing desk in the White House. I wanted to stand on the desk, but since we had special permission to take photos inside the home, I didn't want to jeopardize my opportunity. It was a somber moment when I stood alongside this original bed used by Benjamin Pierce, located in his upstairs bedroom. Less than 5 years after Benny last slept in this bed, he was tragically killed at the age of 11 outside of Andover, Massachusetts. The master bedroom in the manse was where Franklin and Jane slept. Unfortunately, this was not their original bed, but has been reputed to be a bed from the house next to the Pierces when they lived in this home. The painting above the fireplace was Frank Robert Pierce, who died in that very room on November 14, 1843, at the age of 4 from epidemic typhus. It's unimaginable how grief-stricken Franklin and Jane must have been when they lost their little Frankie. A timeless reflection of me as I posed near the shaving kit used by President Franklin Pierce. The shaving kit was situated on a corner stand in the master bedroom. The president was known as Handsome Frank, and he looked in that very mirror while he shaved. When I saw my reflection in the same mirror, I thought I looked pretty darn good as well. It was an honor to stand on the original floorboards inside the Pierce Manse. Just 4 years after Franklin walked out of the door behind me for the final time, he walked through the front doors of a large white mansion in Washington, D.C. Brigadier General Franklin Pierce in 1852. The building behind me was built in 1826 and once played host to Franklin Pierce's law office. It's believed to be the first three-story brick building on Main Street in Concord. Pierce's most notable case was when he defended the religious liberty of the Shakers, the insular sect threatened with legal action over accusations of abuse. Although Franklin Pierce loved being a lawyer, his true passion was in politics, and that devotion bothered his wife considerably. After Franklin Pierce defeated Winfield Scott in a landslide during the 1852 presidential election, he and his family spent the Christmas holiday in this house behind me. In 1852, the home was owned by John Aiken, President-elect Pierce's brother-in-law. And when I say landslide, Pierce had secured 254 electoral votes to Scott's embarrassing 42. On January 6, 1853, Pierce, along with his wife Jane and 11-year-old son Benny, left this house and boarded a train for Concord. A few minutes outside of Andover, the train derailed and killed the boy. On January 10, 1853, Benjamin Pierce's funeral was held in this house. Jane with son Benny in 1850. The Eagle Hotel, located across Main Street from the New Hampshire State House, was where President-elect Franklin Pierce spent the night before he headed to his inauguration in Washington, D.C. in 1853. Jane Pierce did not accompany her husband to Washington, as she wondered whether the accident which killed Benny was divine punishment for her husband's pursuit and acceptance of high office. Depressed from his son's tragic death, Franklin Pierce stood on the steps of the East Portico of the United States Capitol, where he recited the oath of office on March 4, 1853. At age 49, Pierce was the youngest president to date. He was also the first in history to deliver his entire inaugural address from memory. Franklin's speech began from his heart, and his pain was obvious. My countrymen, it is a relief to feel that no heart but my own can know the personal regret and bitter sorrow over which I have been born to a position so suitable for others rather than desirable for myself. Inauguration of Franklin Pierce, March 4th, 1853. The top hat to my left, made of beaver pelt, was worn by Franklin Pierce during his inauguration ceremony on March 4, 1853. When Franklin Pierce moved into the executive mansion without his wife Jane, a couple of tragic events unfolded before he could get comfortably settled into the mansion. On March 30th, 1853, former First Lady Abigail Fillmore passed away at the Willard Hotel. Fillmore had come down with pneumonia after attending Pierce's inauguration, and she never left Washington. Less than 3 weeks later, Vice President William Rufus King died at the age of 67 on April 18, 1853. King passed away from tuberculosis at his home in Selma, Alabama, without carrying out any duties as vice president. The office of vice president remained vacant for the remainder of Pierce's term, as the Constitution then had no provision for filling the vacancy. A little over a year into his term, President Pierce was torn with the decision whether or not to support a new slavery bill known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. On May 30th, 1854, Pierce signed the bill into law. This legislation allowed the residents of the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide by a vote whether to be free states or slave states. Since both were north of the Missouri Compromise line, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the compromise, which had been law since 1820. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also killed the Whig Party, which at the same time sparked the beginning of the Republican Party to fill the anti-slavery void in politics. First Lady Jane Pierce. Pierce wore this shirt, now on display at the Pierce Manse, during his time as President of the United States. President Pierce failed to be nominated by the Democratic Party in 1856 for re-election. Instead, they chose James Buchanan to carry their torch. During Pierce's single term in office, no new states joined the Union. The United States was still at a total of 31 states. When Franklin and Jane Pierce walked out of the executive mansion for the final time on March 4, 1857, they attended Buchanan's inauguration. The Pierces also remained in Washington for over 2 months, staying with former Secretary of State William L. Marcy. During the next 2 years, Franklin and Jane traveled to Europe and the Bahamas before they returned to the U.S. to settle down in Concord. Once the Pierces returned to the United States after traveling abroad, Jane's bouts with tuberculosis worsened. On December 2nd, 1863, the 57-year-old former First Lady died in the Andover home of her brother-in-law, John Aiken. Jane's funeral service was held in this home, which was where her son Benny's funeral was conducted over 10 years earlier. Franklin Pierce had endured an endless amount of tragedy during his adult life. He lost all three of his children before they became teenagers, and his wife died just 6 years after leaving the White House. Pierce began drinking while serving as president, likely due to seeing his son killed in the train accident. But once he returned to Concord and he lost his wife, Franklin's consumption of alcohol grew out of control. On the second anniversary of Jane's death, Franklin Pierce was baptized in his wife's church, which was St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Concord. Pierce liked his wife's church over his congressional denomination because the clergy kept politics out of their sermons. Unfortunately, a 1984 fire destroyed most of the interior of the original church where Franklin Pierce worshiped. During my visit, however, I posed in the pew once used by Franklin Pierce. I'm guessing the pew must have been salvaged after the fire. Another artifact was saved from the original church as well. I'm standing on the baptismal font likely used during the baptism of Franklin Pierce in 1865. The stone steps I'm posing on are in front of the site once occupied by the Pierce Mansion, which was built in 1852 along Concord's Main Street and was destroyed by fire in 1981. The Pierce Mansion, where the president lived from 1857 until his death in 1869. When Franklin and Jane Pierce left Washington, they rented this mansion from the owner, Willard Williams, and stayed here on and off for the rest of their lives. Following the unexpected death of his wife in 1863, Franklin crawled inside a whiskey bottle and never came out. With his heightened addiction to alcohol, the president's health steadily declined and he spent a lot of time alone in the rented mansion. A caregiver was hired during his last few days. At 4:40 a.m. on October 8, 1869, Franklin Pierce died at age 64 from cirrhosis of the liver in the rented mansion on this site. Following his death, the president lay in state in the New Hampshire State House until his funeral service was held across the street at St. Paul's Church. This is the Hall of Flags inside the New Hampshire State House. Since there was no rotunda, this was the likely spot where President Franklin Pierce laid in state in 1869. 3 days after his death, the funeral for President Franklin Pierce was conducted in St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where he had been baptized just 4 years earlier. Even though the interior of the church had been gutted by fire in 1984, this was the likely spot where Pierce's casket was positioned during his funeral service on October 11, 1869. When the service concluded, the president's casket was placed on a horse-drawn carriage where it made the short journey to the Old North Cemetery in Concord. While a lot of citizens of Concord were not fond of President Pierce's politics and his hands-off approach to slavery, they gathered in throngs to pay their final respects when their native son was laid to rest alongside his wife and three sons. On October 11th, 1869, the casket of Franklin Pierce was interred into the grave below me, where Jane and his sons Franklin Jr., Frank Robert, and Benjamin Pierce were already buried. Franklin Pierce is widely considered by historians as one of our worst presidents, and that was due to his indecisiveness over the institution of slavery. But in fact, Fillmore had failed before him, and Buchanan failed after him. Pierce was unfortunate to be elected during a time when our country couldn't have been more divided. Our nation needed a superhero more than ever, and they got one in 1861. When the New Hampshire Congress finally approved funds for a statue honoring the state's only president, the Republicans made sure it was erected on the grounds furthest from the State House. This bronze statue of President Franklin Pierce was dedicated on November 25, 1914, which was 45 years after his death. When I looked up and saw the statue's face, it was easy to tell Franklin Pierce was America's saddest president. Well, that concludes another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. Did you manage to stay away from the booze like old Jefferson? Please do us a favor and subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. And please feel free to leave a comment. Our next show will feature a story about the life of perhaps our worst president in history, James Buchanan. Please tune in. The bobblehead and I think you'll like it. Now it's time to drag TJ away from the booze and get him home. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon, likely at an AA meeting. So long.